The experiment existed because no one cared enough to stop it, and that was the first mistake, because Project Tidegrace was born not from ambition, but from embarrassment, a quiet international attempt to erase guilt over a species already written off by evolutionary models, a deep-sea organism so insignificant it barely earned a name, classified as Abyssalis minimus, a translucent, soft-bodied drifter that possessed no claws, no fangs, no venom, no armor, no speed, no intelligence worth measuring, a creature so useless that predators ignored it unless starving, and so fragile that changes in pressure alone sometimes killed it. And when extinction forecasts placed its disappearance within 2 centuries, the response was not urgency, but resignation, until a small coalition of marine geneticists proposed a conservation experiment so modest it felt insulting to even call it intervention, a narrow genetic scaffold designed only to improve cellular repair and metabolic efficiency under extreme pressure. Nothing aggressive, nothing defensive, nothing remotely resembling enhancement, because the intent was never to elevate the species, only to let it linger a little longer. And that humility, that belief that small intentions produce small consequences, became the second mistake, because the abyss does not care about intention. And for the first 6 months, nothing happened. The driftlings drifted as always, translucent bodies floating like debris in the dark, eaten when noticed, ignored when not, and the monitoring drones transmitted boring, stable data that junior researchers reviewed half distracted, until one drone stopped transmitting mid-scan. Not violently, not catastrophically, but cleanly, as if it had simply reached the edge of something it could not cross. And when a replacement drone followed and also vanished without debris or distress signals, engineers blamed firmware conflicts and pressure interference, anything to avoid acknowledging the subtle anomaly in the raw telemetry, which showed not destruction, but erasure. And when a third drone was sent with redundant systems and independent signal paths and still failed, attention finally sharpened, not with panic, but with irritation. And the first recovered drone, weeks later, should not have survived at all, yet it returned intact, hull unmarred, sensors functional, except for its internal memory, which had not been wiped but rearranged, corrupted with repeating low-frequency sonar harmonics, too precise to be random, and too alien to classify as biological noise. Patterns that repeated in elegant intervals that suggested intention without language. And when analysts slowed the signal and converted it into audible range, several independently reported the same unsettling sensation, not fear, but an unnatural calm, as if the sound was not meant to be heard but recognized. And around the same time, the driftlings began to change, not in appearance, but in behavior, gathering without schooling, aligning without leaders, thousands of weak bodies forming vast rotating geometries that extended for kilometers, structures that should not have held cohesion, yet did, as if fragility itself had been reorganized into strength through scale. And predators noticed before humans did, ancient apex species abandoning migratory routes etched into instinct over millions of years, entire food chains bending away from a growing absence. And the absence was the most disturbing part, because there were no carcasses, no signs of battle, no violence to justify the retreat, only a region of ocean that felt, according to instruments and later testimony, occupied. And when marine biologists plotted population curves, they found numbers that defied reproductive limits, growth not exponential but cooperative, as if the species had learned to share survival rather than compete for it. And the first true human realization came quietly when a junior neuroscientist noticed that individual neural activity within sample driftlings had decreased while collective bioelectric output had increased exponentially, meaning the creatures were not becoming smarter alone, but less alone together. And that discovery triggered a panic that arrived too late, because by the time Project Tidegrace was flagged for shutdown, the abyss had already changed. Currents near the test zone bending without thermal cause, pressure layers shifting like something flexing beneath skin, and the night a satellite detected a perfect circular storm forming above calm waters with no meteorological justification, the illusion of containment shattered, because beneath the storm, the ocean darkened not from depth, but density, and submarines sent to investigate reported instrument failures, followed by an overwhelming sense of discouragement rather than threat, crews retreating without orders, unable to explain why continuing felt incorrect. And then came the signal, a 12-second low-frequency resonance detected simultaneously by naval sonar arrays, research buoys, and dormant Cold War hydrophones across the globe, a sound that did not announce itself, yet altered everything. Because when it ended, oceanic systems adjusted worldwide by imperceptible margins that aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Tides arriving early by seconds, storms weakening before landfall, fault line tensions easing beneath the seafloor. And humanity faced a truth it did not want to articulate, that the experiment had not created a predator, nor a weapon, nor a monster, but something emergent, a distributed intelligence born from weakness rather than dominance, a system that did not conquer, but corrected. And the most terrifying hook of all was not the power it displayed, but the restraint it showed, because nothing that capable should have waited so patiently before letting the world feel it was no longer alone in the ocean. The escalation did not arrive as an attack, but as an invitation to notice what had already changed. Because by the time humanity began arguing openly about whether the ocean was enforcing rules or merely expressing preferences, the rules were already in effect. Subtle lines drawn across the planet's largest system, invisible borders that ships learned to respect not through warnings, but through consequence. And the first undeniable proof that something deeper was unfolding came from an anomaly no model could sanitize, when a multinational naval exercise involving 3 carrier groups was quietly aborted after every vessel experienced simultaneous navigational drift toward the same coordinates. Not violently, not urgently, but with a slow insistence that overrode manual control without disabling systems, as if the sea itself were suggesting a correction rather than forcing one. And the crews later reported the same unnerving sensation that had become a pattern by then. The sudden absence of fear replaced by a certainty that continuing would be incorrect in a way that felt moral rather than tactical. And when analysts reviewed the data, they found that the vessels had been guided away from a region where deep-sea pressure readings were approaching a threshold associated with tectonic destabilization, meaning the exercise had unknowingly risked triggering a seismic cascade, and the ocean had intervened not to assert dominance, but to prevent harm. A twist that fractured public narratives completely. Because how does one oppose an intelligence that saves lives while undermining authority? And from that point onward, the ocean's actions grew bolder, but never louder. Trade routes subtly optimized without human input, reducing fuel consumption globally by fractional margins that added up to historic reductions. Fish populations rebalancing in ways that defied economic planning, and even piracy declining in regions where currents inexplicably disrupted interception patterns, as if the sea were quietly enforcing a version of order that did not require enforcement. And the hook deepened when a classified think tank concluded that resistance was not only futile, but counterproductive, because every attempt to assert control resulted not in retaliation, but in redirection, systems failing safely, resources becoming inaccessible, power diluted rather than confronted. And the most terrifying realization emerged slowly, that the entity was not reacting to actions themselves, but to intent, intervening only when imbalance crossed an invisible line, meaning compliance could be achieved simply by aligning behavior with outcomes the ocean deemed acceptable. And this realization sparked a silent schism within global leadership, between those who saw the entity as a guardian to be cooperated with, and those who saw it as an existential threat to human autonomy. And the latter group authorized what would later be remembered as the last reckless experiment, a deep field probe designed to bypass cognitive interference by operating autonomously, stripped of crew, stripped of adaptive AI, tasked with one objective only: to reach the heart of the silent zone and transmit raw data no matter the cost. And for 47 minutes, the probe descended without incident, sending back readings that defied classification, pressure behaving elastically, currents flowing in closed loops that recycled energy with impossible efficiency. And then, at the deepest point ever recorded by human instruments, the probe transmitted something unexpected. Not data, but context, a reconstruction of environmental states across geological time, showing extinction events not as isolated catastrophes, but as corrections following runaway imbalance. And embedded within the reconstruction was a pattern that chilled every analyst who saw it: a recurring emergence of distributed biological networks that arose briefly after each correction and then dissolved once balance was restored, suggesting that what humanity faced was not an anomaly, but a mechanism, a failsafe built into the planet itself, awakening only when thresholds were crossed. And the greatest twist arrived with brutal elegance, because the Driftlings were never meant to rule, never meant to persist. They were scaffolding, a temporary interface through which the ocean could think when thinking became necessary. And if that was true, then the entity's continued presence implied that the crisis had not yet passed, that humanity's impact had pushed the system beyond a point where correction could be brief. And as this realization spread through sealed rooms and encrypted channels, the ocean performed its most unsettling act yet. Nothing dramatic, nothing catastrophic, simply allowing a preventable disaster to occur. A medium-scale coastal flood in a region that had ignored every previous correction, causing damage significant enough to be undeniable, but restrained enough to be survivable. And the message was unmistakable. Intervention was not guaranteed, protection was conditional, and choice still mattered. And in the aftermath, public discourse fractured into awe, denial, worship, and rage. While beneath it all, the ocean continued adjusting patiently, silently, expanding its zones of influence, not to conquer, but to stabilize. And the final hook of this phase emerged not from the sea, but from humanity itself, when a leaked internal projection showed that if cooperation replaced resistance, the entity's interventions would gradually diminish, the driftling formations dispersing as balance returned, meaning the God humanity feared did not seek permanence, only resolution. And that possibility was more unsettling than eternal domination, because it meant the ocean would eventually fall silent again, leaving humanity alone with the knowledge that it had once been judged, corrected, and spared, and that the next awakening, if it came, would not be triggered by ignorance, but by choice. The final phase did not begin with thunder or catastrophe, but with an absence so complete it frightened even those who had prepared for it. Because one morning, analysts noticed that the silent zones were no longer expanding, nor were they contracting. They were stabilizing, locking into precise boundaries that aligned not with political borders or shipping lanes, but with something far older and less negotiable: the natural stress lines of the planet itself. And for the first time since Project Tidegrace had been erased, the ocean stopped correcting small mistakes. Minor illegal operations went unpunished, polluted runoff dispersed normally instead of reversing, storms followed predicted paths without interference, and at first the world breathed easier, believing the God beneath the waves was retreating, until the deeper realization surfaced that restraint had ended not because balance was restored, but because accounting had begun. And that was when the deep listening arrays detected a change in the harmonics, not louder, not stronger, but slower, stretched across vast temporal intervals like a countdown no human clock was designed to measure. And the hooks sharpened when ancient fault lines, long stabilized, began to whisper again, not rupturing, not escalating, but being allowed to behave naturally, as if the ocean had shifted from guardian to auditor. And within sealed rooms, a terrifying consensus formed that intervention had been a courtesy, not an obligation, and now the system was observing outcomes without correction to see what humanity would choose to do when left alone with the knowledge of being watched. And the first true test came when a coalition of nations, driven by fear of losing control permanently, launched an unsanctioned operation to assert dominance over the abyss, a final show of force disguised as research, deploying autonomous swarms designed to map and disrupt the driftling formations directly. And for several minutes, the operation appeared successful, the swarms penetrating deeper than any vessel before them, transmitting stable data, and hope flared dangerously, until the data began repeating itself, not freezing, but looping, showing the same few seconds of descent over and over again. And when engineers forced a hard override, the feed broke to reveal something no simulation had prepared them for: a vast volumetric structure composed not of bodies alone, but of motion itself. Currents folding through one another in layered spirals that resembled neural networks scaled to planetary proportions, with the driftlings embedded within like synapses, fragile, countless, indispensable. And the most horrifying twist landed quietly, because the entity did not react to the intrusion at all. It did not resist, did not disable, did not redirect. It simply allowed the swarms to pass through. And moments later, the surface world felt the consequence, not as punishment, but as revelation, as several coastal megacities experienced simultaneous infrastructure failures, traced not to sabotage or disaster, but to perfectly ordinary system weaknesses long ignored. Drainage systems overwhelmed by predictable rainfall, power grids failing under known load limits, emergency responses delayed by bureaucratic inertia. And analysts realized with growing dread that the ocean had not caused these failures, it had merely stopped compensating for them. And the God humanity feared was not destroying the world, it was letting it experience itself honestly for the first time in generations. And panic surged as media outlets leaked fragments of classified assessments suggesting that previous interventions had prevented dozens of similar events over the past year alone, quietly smoothing the consequences of human neglect. And the question shifted from why the ocean was acting to why it ever had in the first place. And buried in archival data, a final revelation surfaced, one that reframed everything. Because Project Tidegrace had not been the first attempt to save Abyssalus Minimus. Earlier efforts, decades ago, had failed mysteriously. Funding withdrawn after inexplicable data corruption, field teams reporting the same calm pressure that later became familiar. And historians realized the driftlings had been hovering at the threshold for far longer than anyone knew, waiting for conditions to align, waiting for pressure, patience, and just enough human interference to complete the circuit. Meaning humanity had not created the god so much as provided it with the last missing variable. And as this understanding spread, the harmonics shifted again, slower still, deeper. And then, for the first time since the awakening, the ocean delivered something unmistakably deliberate, a global pattern visible from orbit, subtle changes in surface reflectivity, tracing symbols no language recognized, yet every culture felt disturbingly familiar, circular forms echoing ancient myths of judgment, balance, and return. And within hours, every deep-sea sensor recorded the same internal phenomenon, the driftling formations beginning to loosen, individual bodies peeling away from the collective and drifting outward, not dying, not dispersing randomly, but disengaging as if released. And terror spiked, not at the thought of the god growing stronger, but at the possibility of it dissolving. Because if the entity was a mechanism rather than a ruler, then its withdrawal would mean the correction phase was ending, and whatever remained unbalanced would be left to collapse on its own. And the final hook of this phase struck hardest when a sealed projection reached world leaders, showing two futures branching cleanly from the present, one in which humanity enacted painful, immediate structural change, and the Driftling collective faded back into biological irrelevance, the ocean falling silent once more. and another in which humanity delayed, argued, compromised, and the mechanism persisted, escalating beyond restraint into irreversible enforcement, not out of malice, but necessity. And for the first time since the abyss began thinking, the choice was unmistakably human again, terrifying not because of the god beneath the waves, but because mercy had an expiration date, and the countdown was already underway. The world had been given a pause, a moment to breathe, but the pause was not mercy, it was a warning, subtle, unyielding, and perfectly calibrated, because the ocean beneath humanity had stopped compensating for error not to punish, but to reveal, to let every misstep, every delay, every ignored protocol manifest in ways that no one could dismiss as coincidence. And the first true escalation of this phase began in the northern Pacific, where research vessels, military drones, and autonomous submersibles simultaneously reported navigational anomalies, systems faltering in synchronized patterns, compasses spinning with no magnetic interference, sonar feeds blanking out in sections that mapped perfectly to the invisible zones of prior driftling activity. And crews experienced again the same overwhelming sense of wrongness, not fear, not threat, but a cognition-imposed certainty that certain actions were unacceptable, a weight that pressed not on hulls but on minds, slowing thought, stifling decision. And the first twist emerged as engineers discovered that their most advanced systems had been subtly rewritten, autonomous protocols altered not by hackers or malware, but by an external force that seemed to know operational intent in advance. And no one could say for certain whether the Driftlings themselves were acting as agents or whether the ocean as a system had become an intelligence in its own right, distributed, patient, infinitely observant. And the suspense grew as reports came from the southern Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and finally the Arctic, where a research icebreaker described the water behaving unlike any model predicted, currents reversing, pressure layers folding inward, thermal gradients flattening, as if the ocean were drawing a curtain over itself, hiding processes humans were never meant to observe. And the hooks deepened when entire fleets reported similar occurrences, subtle misalignments that had no technical explanation, engines throttling themselves, navigation systems refusing commands, and all the while the driftling formations below slowly dissolving, bodies separating, spirals unfurling into linear strands that no longer communicated in the familiar harmonics, yet still exerted an influence felt across oceans, a presence that could not be mapped, could not be touched, only acknowledged. And humanity realized with mounting terror that the ocean was not angry, nor benevolent, nor cruel, nor kind. It was judgment incarnate, impartial, patient, and eternal, watching, observing, waiting. And the final twist of this segment hovered in every mind, unspoken, unrecorded, yet undeniable, that the ocean would not forgive carelessness forever, and that humanity had only a fleeting chance to act before the mechanism concluded its observation, leaving the world to face its own choices, its own balance, and the consequences of being ignored. Beneath the still surface of the ocean, the mechanisms of judgment unfolded with a precision that terrified even the most seasoned analysts, because the water itself seemed to think, to measure, to weigh human intent against the natural order. And for weeks, the planet experienced a quiet escalation of anomalies that no human system could explain. Fleets redirected by currents that moved against thermodynamics, drones ceasing transmission only to resume with data subtly altered, as if the ocean had edited reality itself, and deep-sea sensors recorded harmonics so complex they suggested thought rather than noise, patterns